David Booth is an associate professor in the Department of Religion at St. Olaf College. He received his doctorate from the University of Chicago. He studies and writes about philosophy, history of religion, and the feminist study of religion. Welcome to the program, Bill.
Nice to be here, Tim.
So I understand you're a Minnesota or Minneapolis resident.
I do live in Minneapolis, and I drive down to Northfield each day with a really nice carpool of colleagues at St. Olaf.
Over the past year, David Booth has tracked the course of and commented on the now failed attempt to have marriage defined only as a union between a man and a woman in the Minnesota state constitution. His recent perceptive analysis of the defeat of the so-called marriage amendment in MinnPost has caught our attention. Early polls showed that this amendment was going to pass. So what happened?
First of all, it was astonishing and exhilarating to those of us who hoped for its defeat. When it was defeated, I sat down and made a top 10 list of factors in the process, the underlying dynamic of discussion leading up to the vote. And I settled on three that I think are especially interesting, worth talking about. The proponents of the amendment worked overtime to obscure the discriminatory intent and effect of the amendment. They made frequent statements to the press, in the media, protesting that there was no discrimination or harm intended, that certainly there was no hate intended, that it was simply an effort to offer citizens the opportunity to define marriage. And of course, that struck me as a sleight of hand, because in this case it was a definition that had no special meaning except to exclude one class of citizens from the legal recognition that the majority of citizens enjoy. The Archbishop protested loudly that there was no ill will intended towards gay and lesbian citizens. There were many legislators who stood up.
The Catholic vote was fragmented on that issue.
Indeed it was, and I think that's another really interesting story, is just the unexpected breakdown of religious intentions and positions on that. But the campaign to pass the amendment tried to position themselves actually as victims of an agenda that would rob them of their right to define marriage. And they insisted loud and long that they were not discriminating, when in fact the plain effect or the plain result of the amendment was to deprive real families of the legal recognition that the majority of Minnesotans take for granted. So I thought it was a striking factor in the discussion leading up to the debate that the side that was trying to write discrimination into the Constitution protested loud and long, perhaps protested too much, that discrimination was not part of their intent.
Okay. What are some of the other top factors?
I think Minnesota's marriage discussion represented a kind of milestone in the public perception of the role of religion in politics. Going back to the Reagan era, when Mr. Reagan forged a really effective alliance between religion and political conservatives, it's become customary and a little bit too easy simply to identify religion with social conservatism. And of course, America's religious history includes proud moments of religious progressivism on social issues. And in the case of Minnesota's marriage discussion, Minnesotans United for All Families, the official campaign to defeat the amendment, an astonishingly effective, innovative, accountable, well-organized campaign. They had an explicit outreach to faith organizations. They had hundreds of faith organizations and faith leaders who were explicit coalition partners. There were phone banks organized in church basements and in synagogues. There were official statements taken by many religious denominations and religious communities opposing the amendment. The communication director of Minnesota for Marriage, the pro-amendment campaign, Chuck Darrell, had quipped in the press, if they're going to defeat this amendment, they'll need a lot of atheists. And that just turned out not to be true at all. Not only was it the case that there were many faith groups, Hindus, Buddhists, Christians, Jews, that came out formally against the amendment, but Even the largest religious community that came out officially for the amendment was internally divided in interesting ways. And of course, here I'm referring to Minnesota's great Catholic community, yes, where the Archbishop and the official proponents of the archdiocese position argued loud and long, and some said heavy-handedly, that a vote for the amendment was a vote for nature, a vote for stability, a vote for civilization. Large numbers of Catholics, perhaps guided by their earlier social justice teaching, didn't see it that way. In the neighborhoods where vote no signs sprouted all over yards,
Catholic voting no,
there was the great sign, another Catholic voting no. The old careless equation of religion with social conservatism broke down in this case, and I don't think that's a viable equation going forward. I think going forward, religious communities will be just as active on progressive social issues as other religious communities are on conservative social issues.
What if the Archbishop doesn't subscribe to that? I mean, he's attempting to maintain a monolithic presentation on the part of the church. What if a social issue comes out? Is there some reason that you think that he's going to back away from taking what he believes to be the church's position in those matters?
I certainly don't. I think the Archbishop is bound
Who's
by...
a conservative, I mean, recognized.
Absolutely. But he's bound by conscience and also by the office he holds to articulate a position that is the position sorted out by the hierarchy and the authoritative teaching of the church. But what we see over and over again is that Catholic laity in the pews, they have strong wills, and they have their own conscience, and they make their own judgments about issues that affect the well-being of their neighbors. Certainly in this case, they were clearly motivated by a sense of the real harm that would be done to gay and lesbian families by the passage of the amendment.
Well, your MinnPost article focused in on the strategy that was employed by Minnesota United for All Families. Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, that was an amazing strategy. I think it was a strategy that was schooled in great part by the failure to defeat amendments of this kind in other states around the country, as was the case in Maryland and Washington and Maine. Had really focused on rights-based arguments, articulating the equal right of American citizens.
Abstract, in other words.
Exactly. And Minnesotans United really sought to make a concrete appeal. And so they did a couple things that were unusual or novel. They focused on building a mighty network of personal conversations.
If I might interject, of course, what did they have, about $15 million to spend also?
They had a lot of money, and I think it's fair to notice that that money was raised the good old-fashioned political way by looking for donors, not the newfangled way of letting a few rich people fund things.
Excellent point. Anyway, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Well, they had a campaign that made over 900,000 phone calls in the last month of the campaign. These were calls where people were invited to tell their own stories of how the passage of the amendment would affect them personally or people they knew and loved. And so it was a campaign that was personal in its character, grounded in realism and empathy, because rather than touting 14th Amendment claims or freedom of religion claims,
There's nothing wrong with those.
which are absolutely sound, and I think all those claims stack up on the side of marriage equality. But Minnesotans United decided those were not winning talking points. And so they opted for talking points that told the stories of real gay and lesbian citizens, their real families, and the people who care about them. And I think in the end that this has the potential to be transformative, a kind of watershed in Minnesota politics. You had a group of campaign volunteers who were energized to tell long-hidden stories, who were empowered to find the courage to tell stories that they had been afraid to tell openly. And in the context of a large campaign to turn back a discriminatory amendment, they found the courage to talk to neighbors, friends, strangers, co-religionists, other religious communities, and say, this is who I am, this is the truth of my life, and this is how the amendment hurts me. And I'm struck by the fact that, according to the most recent census, there are in the ballpark 10,000
Right.
same-sex families. These are families in every real respect. These are people who get up together, make a household together, raise children together, plan for their financial future together, do the laundry or argue about the laundry together. These are families in every sense, except the sense of legal recognition. And the proponents of the amendment ignored the reality of those families and ignored the well-being of those families as they touted abstract images of the one-man, one-woman, biologically fruitful family, which is, of course, a fine family model. There are many excellent families, but the reality is there are also other kinds of families. And their lives are enhanced when they are recognized and respected in law, and their lives are harmed when they are denigrated and barred from legal recognition. Minnesotans United grounded their campaign in the reality of those families and in empathy for those families, and the other side just couldn't match that.
Couldn't or didn't? Do you think Minnesota for Marriage had a story to tell that they could have put forward that would have been more empathetic?
As was the case with every other successful marriage amendment, their campaign was run by
California.
a Californian. His name escapes me at this instant. But he ran the same kind of campaign in every case. In fact, he recycled ads in Minnesota that he had showed in Massachusetts and in Maine and in New Hampshire. And they did not, in fact, tell real stories about real people. They told distorted stories, and that's what they went with.
And I know you're not a political science, you're a professor of religion. But the next battle, probably in the state of Minnesota, will be an attempted repeal of the state statute that presently bars same-sex individuals from getting married. What do you think the legislature, in its collective wisdom, should be taking into account?
I'm not by any means a political scientist or an expert observer of the legislature, but I have been watching and thinking carefully about marriage politics for a very long time, and it is not unreasonable to read the defeat of the amendment as an implicit endorsement of the idea of equal treatment in marriage law. And I think that the circumstances of this legislature are completely different from the circumstances of the legislature that put forward the amendment. The amendment has now been exposed as a discriminatory effort. According to some legislative staff, it was put forward cynically by some as a way to boost turnout.
It did. They succeeded.
They did succeed. That's right. Woe to them. They succeeded. But that was an effort to restrict the range of the rights and dignity of a vulnerable minority of our neighbors. And that was overreaching, I think. The incoming legislature, the legislature that will be seated soon, they have an opportunity to address a very different thing, which is not the restriction or diminution of rights, but the recognition of rights that have been long trivialized and denigrated. I'm reminded here of Dr. King's protest to liberal white clergy who urged a gradual approach to the advance of civil rights. And he was quite impatient. He thought that the time to recognize the rights of a minority that have been dispossessed is now, not sometime in the future when it's more pragmatic, but now. And I think that framework may weigh in some legislators' minds right now. I think one other interesting thing is that, as you know, the Supreme Court has announced that in this current session, the Supreme Court will hear two cases involving same-sex marriage. They will hear the appeal of Proposition 8 in California, and they will hear an appeal of the Defense of Marriage, the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, arising out of a case in New York. And the details of the case in New York are such a straightforward example of the unequal treatment of the laws, because the case in New York involves a married pair of women, legally married under the laws of New York, one of whom died and bequeathed to her surviving wife a considerable estate. If they had been one man, one woman, different sex married in federal law, the IRS would have recognized them as married and would have allowed the spousal exemption. And since they were not so recognized, the survivor has been asked by the IRS to pay a very considerable income tax on the inheritance. Her straight neighbors next door to her would not have to pay that tax. I think that most court watchers are pretty certain that that part of the Federal Defense of Marriage Act that prohibits federal recognition of any marriage but a different sex marriage, I think they expect the court to strike that down. And I think it would be a strange position for the state of Minnesota to be in, to be propping up its own state-level DOMA when the Supreme Court had decided that the federal DOMA did not pass constitutional muster. And I think that many legislators will be weighing the uncomfortable incongruity of being a state that had fallen behind the national curve of recognizing these rights. I think there too there will also be some economic considerations insofar as the states that do recognize marriage equality.
The 9 states right now.
Exactly. Those states will be at a considerable competitive advantage in the labor marketplace because there will be powerful incentive for talented same-sex couples to seek the marriage benefit of those states, since that will then carry with it the federal marriage benefit. So I think that it already has been, and it will probably continue to be a year of dramatic developments in the national discussion of marriage equality.
Well, the issue to be still addressed, of course, is whether the Democratic leadership in the state legislature wants to bring that on for a vote. And if you read the tea leaves, it looks like if it comes up at all, it's going to come up later on in the session after they've addressed what they at least would like to say is the true business of the legislature in an attempt to improve the economy.
That makes sense to me as a political calculus. As a student of the history of religious ideas, and as a student of certain moments of great moral reform, I think that we are living through a time of great moral transformation regarding the final long overdue recognition of the full humanity of all of our neighbors, whether they're in the sexual majority or the sexual minority. And I think there's reason to hope that that the citizens have spoken on behalf of equality and against discrimination, and reason to hope that the leadership of the DFL majorities in each of our houses will decide that this is the right time to do the right thing.
Do you think that the successful effort to oppose the amendment will be a template or could be a template for future campaigns? God forbid we see those kinds of divisive social issues on the horizon in the future?
Not only do I think it could be a template for that sort of campaign, but I think in other issues. I think that Minnesota's social progressive community learned a model of political persuasion that can be used in lots of other areas. I think issues about economic fairness, the model of making phone calls to tell personal stories is a really compelling model because it empowers people to be the humans they are. It really recruits the great Wellstone expression, we all do better when we all do better, because we need to be able to tell the stories of what our lives are like and not have them reduced to interest groups or the parodies that political ad makers generate.
Your analysis, both written and oral, has been tremendous. Thanks for stopping by, David.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you, Tim.
We'll see you next time.
Democratic Visions is handmade by volunteers through DFL Senate District 48, Eden Prairie and Minnetonka. Lori Pryor, Chair.